In this next lesson, we're going to talk about equivalent fractions and decimals. Now this lesson is pretty short, pretty straightforward, pretty simple because we've already learned about equivalent fractions. Now we're just going to extend that to equivalent decimals. Let's go ahead and take a look. The first thing we're going to look at is 6/10, and we want to know what is 6/10 equivalent to as hundredths. So just like when we did our fractions and we did equivalency, we need to think, what do we multiply times 10 to get 100? We multiply 10 times 10, and whatever we do to our denominator or our number on the bottom, we need to do to our top number, and so we get 60 hundredths. So 6/10 and 60 hundredths are equivalent fractions. Now, when we turn to decimals, we need to identify, well, what's an equivalent decimal to 6/10? We've talked about this in class, that when we have our decimals, we can add zeros all the way to the right, and that doesn't change the number. But what it does change, or doesn't change the value, but what it does change is the way we say the number. So we want to change when we're saying 6/10. When we say 6/10 because the value of the last digit of the decimal that we see is in the tenths place, we want to change that so that the last digit that we say is in the hundredths place. And so we're going to add a 0 to the end. That's it. That's all we're going to do is add a 0 to the end of our decimal. So 6/10 is equivalent to 60 hundredths. And all we did was add that 0. And now when we read this number, it's going to be 60 hundredths because we read that last digit's place value. Because the last digit's in the hundredths place, we read it as 60 hundredths. So all we did to our numerator, or to our top part when we were dealing with our fraction, was add a 0 on the top and the bottom. All we do when we're changing from tenths to hundredths for decimals is add a 0 to the end of our decimal. Let's go ahead and take a look when we're going from hundredths to tenths. So just like when we were dealing with our fractions on the other page, whatever we do to the top, we do to the bottom, or whatever we do to the bottom, we do to the top. So in this case, we're going from 100 to 10, so we're dividing by 10. Notice how we're taking a 0 away. We have to do the same thing to our numerator, and when we do that, we get 4/10. So 40 hundredths is equivalent to 4/10. Now, just like when we were talking with our decimals before, we say the last decimal place value of that decimal. So when we're reading this, we read 40, and then the last place value is in the hundredths place. And for the tenths, we want to read that as tenths. We know that when we're reading our decimals, the first place value after the decimal is the tenths place. So if we're writing this as a decimal and we're writing it as tenths, we would write 4, and we want that 4 to be in the tenths place, and so that's it. We removed a 0, or like we did on top, we divided by 10. On the bottom, we're just taking that 0 away. So 40 hundredths is the same as 4/10. This is just showing again our fractions equivalency, and this is showing from a fraction to a fraction, and then also what that decimal equivalency is. What you're going to have to do in just a second is take a fraction and then turn it into a fraction of hundredths, that's a fraction and a decimal, and then do the same thing for decimals and turn them into fractions. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. We have 7/10 as a fraction, 70 hundredths, that's what it's equivalent to as a fraction, and then we see as a decimal, this is 7/10, and this is 70 hundredths. On the bottom we have 90 hundredths, so we're going from hundredths to 9/10, and then we have 90 hundredths, again we say that last place value, to 9/10. So decimals and fractions equivalents. I want you to go ahead, and for these we're going to write the number as hundredths in fraction form and in decimal form. So right now our fractions and our decimals, or our mixed numbers, are all in tenths, and we need to change them to hundredths. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to do the first one. If we're changing 3 and 6/10, we need to change it from the current form which it's in, which is tenths, to hundredths. So let's go ahead and change this first one to hundredths. Our 3, our whole number, remains the same, and then we need to change our fraction to hundredths, so it would become 60 hundredths. We also need to write it as a decimal. So my 3 is in my whole number, so it's in my ones place, and then I have 60 hundredths. If I'm doing the decimal version, I need to turn my decimal into a decimal in hundredths. So this would be 50 hundredths, and then as a fraction, it would be 50 hundredths. So that's what we're doing for these problems. We need to change them into a hundredths as terms of a fraction and a decimal. Go ahead and give 3/10 a try. 3/10 as a decimal in hundredths would be 30 hundredths, and then as a fraction it would be 30 hundredths. Next one, go ahead and give 1/10 a try. 1/10 is a fraction, so I'm going to change it into a fraction in hundredths. So I have 10 hundredths, and then as a decimal I would have my 0 in my ones place and then my 10 hundredths. How about 6 4/10 as a mixed number? Go ahead and turn that into a fraction and a decimal in hundredths. So we would have 6 40 hundredths, and then as a decimal we would have 6 40 hundredths. And then finally on this page we have 8 8/10, and I want that as a fraction and as a decimal in hundredths. So I would have 8 80 hundredths, and then I would also have 8 80 hundredths as a decimal. All right, now we went from tenths to hundredths here. Here we need to go from hundredths to tenths. So when we went from tenths to hundredths, we added those zeros. Here we're going to have to take those zeros away. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the first one. I have 1 90 hundredths, and I'm going to write this as tenths. So I'd have 1 9/10, and then I'm going to have 1 9/10. For 5/10, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rewrite this as a decimal and as a fraction in tenths, and I have 5 hundredths, or 5 10 hundredths right now. So I would have 5 1/10 and 5 1/10. Go ahead and give 2 80 hundredths a try. 2 80 hundredths would be 2 8/10, or 2 8/10. How about 7 40 hundredths? 7 40 hundredths would be 7 4/10, or 7 4/10. And again, when we say and, that's our decimal that we're writing. When we say and, when we're writing a mixed number, then that's when we write our fractions. So that and separates our numbers that are greater than 1 from our numbers that are less than a whole. How about 20 hundredths? 20 hundredths as a fraction in tenths would be 2/10, and we would have 2/10. And then finally we have 50 hundredths. This would be 5/10 and 5/10. All right, Christopher says that 8 or 0.08 and 8/10 are equivalent. Is he correct? Explain your reasoning. Go ahead and think about this. Are these two things equivalent? Explain your reasoning. These are not equivalent. Here we have 8, and this 8 is located in the hundredths place. So we have 8 hundredths, whereas in my fraction, I have 8 tenths. 8 tenths and 8 hundredths are not equivalent. What would be equivalent if I had as a fraction would be 8 hundredths, or if I had it as a decimal, I would have 8 tenths. Those would be equivalent, but what Christopher has right there is not equivalent. All right, we have one final problem. Bella walks 0.5 miles to the library after school. Which fraction is equivalent to that? Which of these fractions is equivalent to how far she walks? All right, and I didn't say how I should set decimal, but I didn't want to give your answer away. So this is 5/10. And when we're looking at our options, we don't have anything that's in the tenths. This is the one that has tenths, but that's 50/10, and so that can't be our answer. That would be equal to 5 wholes. So now we need to think, well, what else is equivalent to 5/10? Well, we have 5/10. That would be equivalent to 5/10. And we notice that all of these are fractions, so fractions would be a good thing for us to look at. And then we need to think about, well, what's another equivalent to 5/10? And notice how my other options have 100 in my denominator. So I need to think about an equivalent fraction that has 100 in my denominator. When I multiply my denominator times 10 and my numerator times 10, I end up with 50 hundredths, and that would be my answer. So right there, 50 hundredths is the fraction that's equivalent to 5/10. All right, that's our lesson for today. When we're focusing on equivalent fractions, make sure that your fractions are equivalent. You're doing the same thing to the numerator and denominator. We're either adding a 0 or we're taking a 0 away. That's pretty much the process we're working with here. That's our lesson for today. See you tomorrow.